If you like our global news content and want to see more of it, then be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you never miss an upload. Thanks for your support. It's been a full decade since the Arab Spring. While some of you may have heard of it and others of you likely know a lot about it, it's worth going back to the beginning and explaining how it happened, why it happened, and looking back and deciding whether it was truly successful. The story of the Arab Spring starts in Tunisia, a country that had been under the control of Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Under Ben Ali, freedom of the press was restricted, with critical journalists being tortured. Ben Ali's clear disregard for human rights was made worse in 2011 by his inability to maintain a strong economy, plunging much of his country into unemployment and creating a huge inflation of food prices. For the average person in Tunisia, this made life hard, as demonstrated by Mohamed Bouazizi, a market trader. Bouazizi sold food from a fruit cart, and on the 17th of December 2010, he was approached by a government official asking for a licence. As he was unable to provide one, they confiscated the produce from his cart. He tried to complain at the local municipality office, where he was simply rejected without his case being heard. Frustrated with this, he returned to the municipality office, doused himself in fuel and set himself alight. His case, alongside WikiLeaks documents demonstrating corruption from Ben Ali, sparked a protest in Tunisia. One of the largest of these protests occurred in Tala, where many took to the streets to back Bouazizi and condemn the government. The government responded violently, using tear gas and calling protesters violent extremists. While Ben Ali tried to tone down the response by ordering the police not to use live rounds and promising to make the internet more free, the protests continued, and on the 14th of January 2011, Ben Ali stepped down. Following Ben Ali, an election was scheduled for the end of October, which resulted in Ennahda, an Islamic party, winning. Since the 2011 revolution, there have been some tensions between the Islamists and the secularists, but largely they've managed to compromise. They agreed on a constitution in 2014, and the human rights situation has certainly improved. This is best demonstrated by democracy indices, something we've done a video on before. Basically, they measure how democratic a country is. Polity4 shows that Tunisia has gotten more democratic since the revolution. Freedom House takes a slightly more nuanced view, demonstrating that Tunisians can and do use social media to organise protests, but that some journalists face pressure and intimidation from government officials. Nonetheless, Tunisia has a score of 71 out of 100 on Freedom House, putting it in the free category. So, it seems that the Arab Spring in Tunisia, at least to some extent, was a success. There is a democracy with regular elections and a greater degree of civil liberties than under Ben Ali. However, while the Arab Spring started in Tunisia, many other countries were inspired by it and tried to reform their political systems. We'll run through a few of these and see how many of them were successful. We're going to focus on Libya, Syria and Egypt here. Like Tunisia, many of the countries that joined the Arab Spring in 2011 were headed by leaders who had autocratic tendencies, who gained power in the latter half of the 20th century. Libya was under the control of President Muammar Gaddafi, who overthrew the king in 1969 in a non-violent revolution. Syria was under the control of Bashar al-Assad, whose father, Hafez al-Assad, came to power in 1963 following a coup. Bashar came to power in 2000 following the death of Hafez. Both were brutal dictators who tortured and executed political opposition. In Egypt, Vice President Hosni Mubarak was made the President of Egypt in 1981, as the President was assassinated. Mubarak was corrupt as President and would put activists in prison without trial. In addition to this, a state of emergency from the Six-Day War with Israel in 1967 remained in force for basically the entirety of Mubarak's reign. This meant that censorship was enforced and constitutional rights were suspended. In all of these aforementioned countries, the leaders were presented with serious protests in 2011, largely due to their autocratic tendencies, but also because of things like corruption and domestic policies. In Libya, there were delays over the building of housing units, which confounded the concern of citizens over the state of the economy. This, coupled alongside WikiLeaks' demonstration of corruption from Gaddafi, created the kindling for the revolution. The uprising in Tunisia, though, was the match. In Syria and Egypt, it was much the same. The protests started over corruption and stagnant wages. The protest didn't originally go that well, with the leaders largely using violent means to try to keep the people under control. In Libya, Gaddafi used tanks and the air force to repress his people. In Syria, Assad used tanks, and in Egypt, Mubarak tried to eliminate internet access and used tear gas against protesters, and protesters were killed. For some autocrats, things didn't last and their power was swiftly brought to an end. For example, in Libya, following intervention from the UN, a new National Transitional Council, or NTC, was established. The first democratic election was held in 2012, when the Greater National Council was formed and the NTC was dissolved. Its job was to be the legislative authority of Libya, which it did seem to do, until 2014. In 2014, Libyans headed to the polls to elect yet another transitional body, a House of Representatives, to replace the GNC. The House of Representatives was based in Tripoli. That was until a militant group known as Libya Dawn took over the capital by force, requiring the House of Representatives to retreat to Tobruk, leading to the creation of two centres of power, an internationally recognised one in the east and a self-declared one in Tripoli, known as the Government of National Salvation. In an attempt to end the civil war and reconcile the two parliaments, in 2015 the UN managed to broker a deal, known as the Libyan Political Agreement, that established a Government of National Accord, or GNA, something that hasn't exactly cleared things up, because the Libyan Political Agreement didn't just establish the Government of National Accord. It established a whole network of power, an executive branch, the GNA, a legislature, the House of Representatives from before, and a new presidential council, as well as a new state council, a network that isn't really working. In theory, the political agreement requires the House of Representatives to approve the GNA, something that it's refused to do twice. Then comes the fact that the House of Representatives itself is meant to have formal legitimacy under the agreement, but only after it passed an amendment, something it has, again, failed to do, meaning that there's still no single national authority in Libya. Tensions between two groups have also arisen in Egypt. Once Mubarak fell from power, elections were soon called. Power transferred to his vice president, someone who was only recently promoted to the position to try and appease the protesters. Power was then transferred to the military until democratic elections were held in 2012. Mohamed Morsi won and became the president of Egypt. It's important to note here that he was affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. During his reign, the economy began to crumble and there was a shortage of electricity and fuel. In addition to this, his critics claimed that he broke his promises of an inclusive government and that he denounced his critics as traitors. In 2013, there was a military coup against Morsi. They held an election in 2014, putting Abdel Fattah el-Sisi into power. No one from the Muslim Brotherhood, a group in which Morsi was aligned, stood in the election. As president, el-Sisi has been at odds with the Muslim Brotherhood and has been accused of enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings. As if this isn't bad enough, el-Sisi's government have been accused of arbitrary arrests and torture of children as young as 12. So, while on the surface it might seem that Mubarak was toppled in Egypt, when you consider who he was replaced with, the revolution begins to seem far less than successful. Anyway, moving on to Syria. Unlike Tunisia, Libya and Egypt, the protests in Syria were not able to bring down the autocrat. Bashar al-Assad remains in power today, propped up by powerful nations such as Russia. The Arab Spring sparked the Syrian civil war, a war that has now claimed the lives of around 500,000 people and displaced many more. Groups such as the Islamic State have also gained a foothold in the region, and Assad has been accused of war crimes against his own people. The situation in Syria is unfortunately not looking good, and it's not looking like it's going to come to a conclusion anytime soon. As we've hopefully made clear, while the Tunisian revolution was somewhat successful, the revolutions in Syria, Egypt and Libya cannot really be seen as successful. This is reflected through the democracy indices. While Tunisia had a huge jump in the Polity 4 index following the Arab Spring, Egypt and Syria dropped and Libya increased, although only to a score of 0, i.e. not very democratic. While the Arab Spring was a hugely significant event and brought many autocratic leaders' reign to an end, for many countries the revolution was just not enough to transition these countries to democracies. Let us know what you think about all of this in the comments below. And as always, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers for making videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description below.